And frankly, I think it's a better strategy to have kids questioning when they're with us in our homes, when we're by their sides, when we can coach them through that experience, than when they're 1,000 miles away by themselves on a college campus with no community, and they have their professor or their classmates or whatever ripping apart Christianity, and they've got no resources. It is not good to grow up in a Christian bubble.
I thought you were going to say Christian home.
No.
I was like, wow, that's an edgy start. A bubble.
Christian bubble.
Yes.
Our kids are growing up in a Christian home, so
Yeah.
it'd be a real bummer if it wasn't good.
So I was waiting for the joke.
Home.
Okay, Christian bubble. So what do you mean by that?
Well, we know adults that have kind of grown up in, all their life in the church and just very protected, overprotected, because I think we would say, hey, there's some very good and important and necessary protection that you got to do with your kids. But there are those that are overprotected. They're not exposed to unbelievers very often, or the ideas of the world, or false ideas. And so when they do finally make their way out into the larger world out there, they can get rattled.
Yeah. Yeah, actually this topic that we're going to talk about today of exposing our kids to false beliefs, I oftentimes think of my friend that I met probably about 20 years ago. But when I met her, she was at a point of crisis in her faith.
And so was her husband.
Yeah, actually, you're right.
And her husband was in seminary.
Yeah. So they were considering ministry, but also both for different reasons too, but both kind of really searching and not sure if they should actually commit their lives to the church, because they weren't sure the church was true. And the reason, as I got to know her and talked to her, and we actually spent time with them as a couple, she described a childhood that was really like a Christian bubble, like you're describing. She grew up in a Christian home. She only went to Christian schools, went to a Christian college, and it wasn't until she went out into the working world after graduating college, her first job, and what she described to me was, I met people who weren't Christian, and they were happy, they were nice, they seemed to be fine. And what she had envisioned for like this lost world around her that had been described to her is that people were miserable, that they quote unquote needed Jesus. And so that she would have this Jesus that they needed. And so she could offer that to them and they would be. And so when she finally got exposed to people, started having relationships with people who had different beliefs than her, it absolutely rattled her faith, because she felt like she had been kind of lied to in how the outside world was portrayed to her.
Yeah, I remember we had them over for dinner, and they were just talking about all this doubt and the struggle, and it was a very difficult time for them. And that is one reason why we at Maven do our immersive experiences. If you haven't heard of our immersive experience program, let me describe it a little bit. We basically take young people and put them in situations where they have to talk to unbelievers. They have to talk to people who don't believe what they believe. We do this on purpose. We want Christian kids talking to atheists, talking to Mormons, talking to skeptics, talking to whoever. And we do that through our immersive experience program, which we have 3 types of trips. that really focus on 3 different areas. The first trip is really trying to help young people to know what they believe. And this is our biblical trip, our biblical immersive experience. And what we do is we work with your youth group or your Christian school or your college group, whatever, and we customize an itinerary. We have a whole training package that we send you. You do training with your students. We meet you with one of our field guides at the location for the immersive experience. And then we guide you on this 5 to 7 day trip that is absolutely amazing. And let me just say, you and I have spent years and years and years working with young people in local church ministry, working in junior high ministry, high school ministry, college ministry. We've done parachurch stuff. We've been plenty involved. We've seen all kinds of youth programs, and I think we both would say that we have never seen anything that has more of an impact in terms of a program that has more of an impact on young people than the immersive experiences. And so that's why we have just kind of built that program out and tried to multiply it. So we have the biblical trip, which focuses on what young people believe. So our theology, our doctrine. And we take students to Utah, Salt Lake City, Utah, where they have opportunities to engage with Mormons. And they do so with love and grace. It's civil, but we're talking about the real differences. And what the second trip does is focuses on the why. So, okay, why do we believe this stuff? Why do we believe it's true? It's our apologetics immersive experience, and our prime location has been Berkeley, California, or some people refer to it as Berserkly. But there is no shortage of atheists and skeptics and people who are willing to discuss why Christianity is false with our young people. And so that's the trip where we bring out atheists to debate our students, dialogue the students that we bring up there, and to challenge them on particular issues. And then we'll go to the Unitarian church and talk to the Unitarian pastor, and we go onto Berkeley's campus, and students get in conversations with skeptical Berkeley students. And the purpose of that one is really to help them know why they believe what they believe. And then we have a worldview trip, a worldview immersive experience, which is then saying, okay, and why does all this matter? It's helping them to see how the Christian worldview plays out in business, how it plays out in the arts and entertainment, how it plays out in money and economics. And so these are immersive
government.
In government, all these areas. And these immersive experiences really help get young people out of the classroom setting, and this stuff gets into real life in a lot of different ways. And
now that sounds crazy. Like, not to me.
We're a little crazy here.
Not to me, because I'm used to your craziness now. But when we have faced this kind of pushback from parents when we've tried to do it with our own youth group, or when we've taken groups, parents and other people will say, that seems a little dangerous. That seems a little crazy to purposely take Christian kids, because the kids we take are Christians. They're professing Christian kids. And to take them to places where they're going to be challenged. Yeah. It sounds crazy.
Yeah.
So how do you...
It is. We are a little crazy. We've lost many kids along the way.
We have not.
No. Well, here, the person who thinks this is a little edgy or a little risky, I would say, yeah, it is. And it's also risky not to do it. Maybe more risky, or more risky, or riskier.
Yeah.
Anyway,
I like that better.
It's more riskier to not expose them. And that, I guess I would say, hey, go back to this scene that you opened with, of this husband and wife in seminary sitting at our kitchen table telling us that now they're doubting everything that they grew up believing. That's the other risk. And I think when you get to that point, man, I think that's where we maybe see more people walk away at that point, where there's benefits to doing it the way we do it. So I think part of our approach here is saying, let's be proactive. Number one, we are absolutely convinced that Christianity is true, right? And this is the way we talk with our kids. This stuff is true. It's objectively true. It's not just true for me. It's objectively true. Therefore, any false idea or any objection to it is going to be flawed by its very nature. So it's a matter of kind of figuring out how those things are flawed. But if it's not true, then we don't want to believe it anyway. Right? And this is what Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 15. If Jesus didn't rise from the dead, your faith is useless. Right? So if it's true, we don't have to be afraid of these ideas. And also then we learn how to defend those ideas. And frankly, I think it's a better strategy to have kids questioning when they're with us in our homes, when we're by their sides, when we can coach them through that experience, than when they're 1,000 miles away by themselves on a college campus with no community, and they have their professor or their classmates or whatever ripping apart Christianity, and they've got no resources, right? So yes, there is some risk here. And we've seen students on some of these trips. I would say it's more rare, but students who will then surface some of their struggles, their own unbelief or their own doubts. And that's when I say good. Like those doubts were there, or they were going to be surfacing pretty soon. Much better to have those things surface with us, and we can help them walk through.
Yeah, I think sometimes that pushback we get is thinking that we're going to plant seeds in their minds of doubt, but actually it's what you're saying. It's that the kids will oftentimes start sharing with us, oh, this is something I've wondered about. This never sat right with me or whatever. So it actually does just bring to light some of these questions that they've had and wrestled with. And now they're in a place where they have these leaders from Maven who are modeling that they're not afraid to talk about anything, to have a conversation with an atheist or a Mormon or whoever it is. And so they're we're as a Maven team modeling, hey, we don't have to be afraid. We think this stuff is true.
Yeah, you do have to be careful. I mean, there is risk, and you do have to be careful. You don't want students to be overwhelmed by that stuff. And so that's why we want to do this when they're with us, because we can prevent them from being overwhelmed.
Yeah.
So any kid that's been on one of these immersive experiences who has struggled, you can just see it in their eyes where they start talking and they're saying, hey, man, I'm starting to doubt that atheist said this, and I don't know how to respond to that, and I'm really wrestling. And then what we can do is we can pull that kid aside and then help them deal with some of that without then exposing them to more. So we're very careful in this. But I think the other thing that it helps, what it helps surface, is whether or not the doubts or the unbelief really is intellectual. So because I think a lot of doubts and a lot of unbelief is fueled not by the intellectual, but really by the emotional, the psychological, or by the moral. And in fact, we learned this on one of our very first trips, because we've been doing these immersive experiences for almost 20 years now. In fact, I went on one myself when I was an undergrad at the Christian college I was at. We were there. I was there my freshman year, and a friend talked me into going on a Utah mission trip where we went and we talked to Mormons. And before we did that, we learned a bunch of theology. And so that's when I was really transformed by that trip and thought, oh, I got to do this with my students. And so started doing that with our youth groups. But then when I joined a ministry called Stand to Reason, 15 years ago, we were doing it with our youth groups, and then I started doing it with Stand to Reason. But I remember one of the very first groups that we did it with, or one of the first groups we took on one of these things was J. Warner Wallace's youth group when he was a part-time youth pastor and a full-time homicide detective. But we took one of his groups, and so they were kind of guinea pigs for us. We did the Utah trip, and then he gave me the idea of the Berkeley trip and focusing more on apologetics, because he had some students that had graduated from his youth group who were going to Berkeley, and he's like, hey, I want to help equip those kids, and it was a good opportunity to go see those kids as well. So we ended up doing the apologetics trip with him those first couple of years. But I remember that first year we had one gal who went, and she came from a broken home, kind of a difficult situation with her family, and we saw her really struggle. But there it seemed to be not just intellectual stuff, but there was an emotional kind of pull. And as we kind of did some of our own study, and even talking to a couple of people, talking to a guy, friend Gary Habermas, who is a well-known scholar on the historical evidence for the resurrection, but he's done a lot of work on the issue of doubt, wrote a book on doubt, and he talks about how emotional doubt is so prominent oftentimes. And we've seen that with students, and so actually these trips help surface that, like, what's really going on. Is it that you have these intellectual questions, or what we've seen is that kids who, if they've got difficult situations at home, if there's a broken relationship with their father, or whatever it might be, they've experienced a lot of pain or trauma or whatever, there is a lot of doubt that can creep in. So anyway, all that to say is we want to surface those doubts while they're with us, so that we can identify, is this really intellectual and we need to deal with it? These young people need some good apologetics. Is it really emotional, that there's just hurt and pain, that they've really then turned towards God and said, hey, why did you let this happen? And they really need some healing and some counseling, and just they need to experience the love and grace of God? Or is it moral? Is it just, hey, they're starting to get into sin, and they
don't want there to be a God.
Yeah, exactly. So all that to say, these trips help us have those significant conversations.
Yeah, and I think talking about those trips leads well into, and the prep that we do, what we do with the students leads well to what we can do as parents. What we've learned doing these trips with our youth group so many years ago when we started it, and then how we've incorporated that, you and I, into our parenting. And that is we do teaching beforehand with the group. So we're teaching them truth. We teach them, then we go and have the experience or have a conversation, and then afterwards we debrief with them and talk through what happened, what the person said, what did you think about that, did you notice this? And that debriefing time that we call it, that all three of those pieces are so valuable to the teaching beforehand, the experience, and then the debriefing time together.
Yes.
And that is, we can now just kind of unpack that. Like, how do we do that as parents?
Well, exactly. I think what we've learned from all of this is that, hey, we got to figure out how to do this same thing in our homes, because someone might be out there thinking, okay, yeah, my kid is, I don't know, in some other part of the country, our youth group won't do this, or we're not even part of a youth group, or we can't send our kid on an immersive experience. Although we are working, and I don't know if we're going to be able to pull this off in 2022, but we're working on it, trying to do an open enrollment trip, so that you don't have to be part of a group, but anyone could send their kid on one of these experiences. So we're working on that hopefully for Utah in 2022. But what we've learned are there's certain principles really from these trips that actually I want to see parents start with their kids before they get to high school, before they get to college, and before they would go on one of these trips. I mean, every one of our kids, we have 5 kids, every single kid has been on multiple immersive experiences because we've been able to drag them along with us. But from the earliest of ages, I mean, we've got pictures of being on immersive experience where one of the kids is, a baby in a backpack on our backs.
On the Berkeley campus, or at the Mormon Temple in Salt Lake, or wherever. So it is something we incorporated, not just the trips, but then this kind of mindset of how we want to train our own kids to think about the false beliefs that are all around us.
Yeah, so we have got to be intentional. What we're suggesting here is that, and it's risky, and maybe it's crazy to some people, but we are suggesting that we as Christian parents, as we disciple our kids to know what they believe and why they believe it, to ground them in the Christian faith, one of the best things that you can do is expose them to unbelievers, to expose them to false ideas. Now, the benefits are going to be huge on this. I would say, first off, before you do that, before you expose them to false beliefs, and I think you kind of hit on this, we offer training to our groups first. So our principle has always been truth first, then false idea. So you want to ground your kids in the truth first. Like if your kids don't know anything about the faith and then you're like, all right, here's an atheist. No, that's not the way to do it. You want to ground them in the truth first before you expose them to the error. But as we get our kids grounded in the Christian faith, then there's going to be times that we want to expose them to false ideas. So that's the general pattern, is lay that foundation of truth, then expose them. Now, one of the benefits is that this is one way to motivate kids. And we've seen it on these trips, is that, look, I work with a lot of students around the country who have grown up in the church. Maybe they've been in Christian schools, and it is just difficult to see how much apathy there is amongst many of our youth. And what we've seen is that, man, these immersive experiences, getting exposed to an atheist or a Mormon or a non-believer who challenges them, ends up being huge motivation for these students. Because what we're talking about is a real need that they have. They have a real need to know their faith, know theology, know Christian doctrine, right? Know the great truths of our faith. But even though that's a real need, it's not necessarily a felt need. And it's not until a young person gets challenged. I remember being in Utah with a group, I don't know how many years ago, and we pretty much have these stories kind of almost every trip. But I remember this one kid in particular. He was an 8th grader going into 9th grade, which is kind of the limit. Like that was the youngest. And so there's a little concern that he wasn't prepared. And he was basically a junior high boy, right? So self-explanatory, little goofy, wild, high energy, but and probably didn't prepare himself as well, and ended up he got in a conversation with a Mormon in Utah on one of these trips, and this Mormon guy was an adult. This Mormon guy just thrashed this kid and his partner, because we never let the students do this alone; they're always in partners, but. This kid, his name was Austin. Austin got thrashed by this Mormon who seemed to know his Bible better than, Austin. And Austin came back, and, we were a little concerned when he came back. And kind of everyone knew he got thrashed. And he walked back, and he had a serious look on his face. And this was when we were staying in Manti, in kind of more central, southern Utah. But in a more rural area, and so we were camping in tents. That we were in the park for the Manti pageant, and he went right to his tent and disappeared for like 2 hours, and later emerged, and we were like, what's going on? Were you
crying?
Yeah, weeping, crying, and he had gone right into his tent, pulled out his books, pulled out his Book of Mormon, pulled out his training books that we had him read, and he was going to town and studying and preparing, because he knew the next day we're going out again. And what it did is it created this incredible motivation, and by the end of that week, that motivation turned into study, turned into preparation. He went back out, talked to more Mormons, and I remember by the end of that week he was just lit up. He was just lit up. But so that's one of the huge benefits of exposing your kids to false beliefs. It's just, it motivates them.
Yeah. I think that taps into one of the things we've discovered about these trips, and with our own kids too, is that we're exposing them to false beliefs, but we're showing them that people believe these things, and there's a cost to this. If Christianity is true and people don't believe it, there's consequences for that, eternal consequences. And once you allow your students or your kids to start hearing from and being in dialogue with people who don't believe the truth, it brings it right to their face, and they realize, oh, this isn't just something we do on Sunday. This isn't just beliefs that mom and dad have. There are actually people who believe these things. They're believing lies, and it matters. And that's, I think, what we've seen in so many students and in our own kids too, of just, these aren't just false ideas floating in the air that, oh, that's funny that Mormons believe this thing that sounds crazy to us. No, there are actually people in Utah who are deceived and don't believe the true gospel.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, that this kind of exposure and then what we're doing on these trips, it just reveals that we take this stuff to be significant.
Yeah.
So look, if Christianity was just one of many religious preferences, just like our flavors of our favorite flavors of ice cream, and you've got the Christian flavor of ice cream and the Buddhist flavor and the Islam flavor, and you've got all these different flavors, and you choose whatever you like. Well, that kind of approach isn't compatible with what we're doing.
Yeah.
We're saying, no, these aren't subjective preferences, but the fact that we're going out and making ourselves uncomfortable, challenging ourselves, but going and talking to people who maybe sometimes don't even want to talk to us.
Yeah.
Although what we've discovered is that there are plenty of people who do want to talk about these spiritual things, these significant things. But the whole approach assumes that this stuff is objectively true. It's not ice cream, it's medicine. And people have a disease, and so we are taking the gospel, the good news, to them. So it assumes that. If we had a subjective view of our faith, you can see how that would just completely undermine it. So it infuses and assumes this stuff is significant and that there are consequences, and it helps to help. I guess it helps our young people see that and then take the faith more seriously.
Yeah, and I think too, it just helps them to see that we need them to be involved. And we want them to be involved. We want them to take it seriously. We want them to be involved. They can have an impact on people through dialogue, relationships, conversations. They can have an impact. Christianity isn't just about being comfortable, just going through the motions of the culture, going to school, going to work, The Christian life should be a life that's filled with these kinds of conversations, with these kinds of relationships with people who are lost and need the truth. And it lets our kids know, hey, you're on the team and we need you to play. We need you to be involved too.
Yeah, and when you look at data on how often Christians share their faith, the vast majority of Christians aren't sharing their faith. So this is for many of these students who come on these trips, it's the first time they've ever experienced that.
Yeah.
And so that's good that they get exposure to it. In fact, that's I think kind of what lights them up after these trips. I mean, the students are just they're so excited at the end of this trips. In fact, one of our field guides, Tim Stratton, just led a group from Nebraska. This was just a few weeks ago. Led a group from Nebraska on their first immersive experience to Utah, and he sent me video. He's filming a couple of high school boys who are on this trip. He sends me the video of these kids basically saying, like, this is the greatest day of their life. And what was so great about it, they went out and they were sharing the gospel with Mormons. I mean, it was so cool to see. I think, so the students are motivated. They really see their faith as significant, the way it should be seen. They get to live out the mission of the church. Right? Matthew 28, the Great Commission, go and make disciples, many for the first time. They get to live into that purpose. This is the primary purpose of the New Testament church. Then they also learn their faith much deeper.
Yeah.
And of course, the Austin story is a great example of that. But we just see it time and time again where students come back knowing more about their faith from this whole experience. In fact, at the beginning of the immersive experience, they get these guidebooks that they'll have with, they'll have notes and resources in there. But at the beginning of that guidebook is a survey where it asks them questions about what they believe, if they know certain things, their confidence about certain things. And so often students, when they start this trip, this experience, in the training part of it, they'll just leave stuff blank. Mm-hmm. Most of our kids in our churches really don't know much about their faith. And by the end, we give them that same exact survey after the trip is done, and then they're able to fill some of those things out. So we kind of test them to see, okay, are we being effective? And sure enough, students are going deeper in their knowledge.
Yeah, and the quiz in the beginning is good because, well, first of all, like the Utah one in particular, we just asked them to give a few verses that defend the idea of the Trinity, a basic Orthodox view of the Christian church, the Trinity. And most students can't give a verse.
They can't give a single verse. In fact,
single verse.
I would, if anyone's listening out there and you got a junior high school, college student, just ask your student. Say, hey, what passages in Scripture would you point to that teach the Trinity, and see what they say. And
some of us listening might have to do some homework first and find out the answer to that, because maybe you're listening and you're like, shoot, I don't even know. So, and that's okay. But what we're doing with the students is saying, hey, this is a core belief of Christianity. We're going to go talk to Mormons who reject the idea of the Trinity. And so we have got to know how to defend it using the Bible that the Mormons say they believe also. And so the quiz in the beginning shows the students, oh, shoot, I have some learning to do. This is something I should know. I don't know it, so I've got to learn it. And so that revealing of what we don't know is always good, because it does motivate us to learn.
Yeah, and then as we're motivated to learn these, and especially when we have to speak it to others, right? I mean, one of the most effective ways to learn anything is to have to teach it.
Yeah.
And really on these trips, or when you're talking to an unbeliever, you're trying to explain the truth, so you're having to teach it, explain it, and it helps you to learn it that much better. It's not enough for us to simply teach at our kids.
Yeah.
And when we think about kind of the classical model of education, right? The grammar stage, the logic stage, the rhetoric stage is really that key stage where you take truth and good thinking, good reasoning, logic, put it together, and then you have to you learn to articulate it, speak it, and that really is a missing part in a lot of our discipleship. So when you have to explain it, when a young person has to go onto a college campus and talk to a skeptical student about their faith, that really helps them to, number one, realize what they don't know, and then number two, kind of learn the material, learn the truth in a way that they can actually then explain to others. So they end up just going deeper in their own knowledge of it. So,
okay, and here's another benefit that we've learned for students that go on the trip, for engaging in a life like this, is that you become comfortable with unbelievers. And this is something I think a lot of Christians, we would admit, we can become a Christian. Maybe we weren't growing up or whatever. We become a Christian, we get into the Christian community, and then something happens in us where we start to become now uncomfortable with people who aren't Christians. And we, like that Christian bubble you mentioned. And so we can start to feel uncomfortable with non-believers. And what this lifestyle does, what this trip will do for students, is it starts to make you comfortable with being around people who don't believe what you believe. And that is so vital to the Christian life.
Yeah, I mean, if that's the mission of the New Testament church, is to proclaim the gospel and to make disciples, then we have to be in and among unbelievers.
Yeah.
And when you talk about being comfortable, it's not just being comfortable in terms of the ideas and that, hey, there's these false ideas. I mean, you've got to be uncomfortable with maybe a different lifestyle, right? That there's going to be immorality, there's going to be sin that of course you're not engaging with, but to be around them, to be amongst unbelievers, you're going to just get exposed to that stuff. And so how are we in the world but not of the world? And so when we do trips like these, it helps the young people get comfortable with being around unbelievers, and so that they're not rattled when they see those things. There's a healthy expectation, like, that's an unbeliever. That's how they live. They don't follow God. They haven't submitted their life to Him. So these things should be expected.
Yeah, and we've seen that too in our own kids, just as we've lived life and moved to different neighborhoods, and our kids have gone out and or started a new sports team or whatever. And so we've had many conversations where we pick our kids up from something, or they come home from playing with neighbors and say, "Oh, I found out they're atheists," or, "Oh, I found out they believe or we were talking about this and they said they believe this. What religion is that?" And so it's just this comfortableness and this assumption that we're not living in a world where everyone around us is Christian. We're in a post-Christian culture in America. And so it's just part of life that we want for our kids. And I think, this is what Christians should want, that their kids have this expectation that we're friends with we have family, all of that, with non-believers.
Yeah, I think of Jonah at skateboarding camp. Like, he's doing these skateboarding lessons, and afterwards he's saying, "Yeah, I talked to my buddy, and found out he's a Mormon." And so but it's just natural to him to have these conversations. It's not weird because we're doing we're doing it. He's seeing it modeled, and that's one of the things that's so vital about this, is that there's this modeling that happens. There's and then there's coaching and mentoring that can happen. Like on these trips, the immersive experience trips, we're with the kids, so they can struggle. They can get rattled, and then we're right there walking them through that. And you mentioned this earlier, is that we always make sure there's debrief time with the students. Once they have that encounter with whoever it is, whether it's a formal setting where we bring in an atheist, or whether it's going out on campus and talking to a Christian or a non-Christian student, there's always that time we set aside to debrief, to say, okay, how did it go? Let's talk about it.
Yeah.
And to really check in with them and see how they did. So
yeah, and I was thinking about our one of our daughters had a conversation with a few people the other day, and then she brought up to us what the guy was saying, and she said, so I think he's a pantheist because he was saying he believes da-da-da-da-da. And she was right based on what he was saying his belief was, but she wanted to talk to us about it, and she wanted to unpack, what that was. Of course, she's obviously had some training in worldviews that she could even recognize he believes God's in the trees and this and that, and then so she knew, oh, he's a pantheist. But it is just this comfortableness. She wasn't like rattled, and she wanted to come home, talk to us about it, and unpack it a little bit more. Yeah,
able to kind of coach her on that and take her even deeper. So, so those are the benefits of this. And so I remember when I started doing these, it was like, okay, we can't take every kid on these trips. How do we sometimes bring this stuff home? In fact, that's one of the reasons why I started role playing, or it is the reason why I started doing an atheist role play and a Mormon role play, because I
at
saw
church. You mean
in my speaking
with our own kids?
Yeah, well, sometimes. No, I would. Yeah, I would speak to youth.
Yeah.
And we've just got I've got all these different talks that I do, right? And I just saw how motivating it was to get beaten up by an atheist, to get knocked around by a Mormon. And so I thought, how do I get that back here? And that's when I came up with the idea of, I'm going to role play. In fact, if you go to our YouTube channel you can see. Just go to the Maven YouTube channel and type in Mormon roleplay. I've got video of me at a church in Southern California role playing, and that audience was actually an adult audience. And they get kind of fired up a little bit, but they do get motivated because it makes them uncomfortable. It exposes them and helps them see maybe how little they know. And so it was very motivating. So here's a question after all of that, as we've talked through all this, how do we bring that kind of into our homes? How do we do this with our kids? And so I think we want to kind of finish this off by saying, all right, here are some really practical ideas that we've done. And basically it's figuring out how do we help expose our kids to unbelief and unbelievers. And there's a number of ways you can do it. Number one, just having people in your home. So having a non-Christian neighbor or non-Christian family members. And as you host people in your home, as you practice Christian hospitality, as you have people over for dinner, as you just live life with people and your kids are with you, that provides natural opportunities. We have non-believing family members who come over for meals or for holidays or whatever, and we end up having just conversations, significant conversations, and that is one way that our kids have been exposed to the ideas of unbelievers.
Yeah, and this posture assumes that you are a family that is looking outside and not just inward, and we would suggest that that is actually the Christian way to live life, that we aren't just, our home is not just about us. And, we definitely know that God has provided this home. And so we want to bless other people with the home too. We want it to feel like an open place where our friends are welcome, our kids' friends are welcome, our neighbors, family, everybody. And so it does assume that your family isn't so busy that having people over on a Saturday morning or whatever, it's summer, so I'm thinking to swim or slip and slide or whatever, just to
I was thinking Saturday morning. You don't have people on Saturday mornings to sleep in.
Well, maybe that's a good time to have donuts in your yard with neighbors or something like that. I mean, there's so many things you can do, but it assumes that, you are going to live a life with your kids that is outward looking. How can we as a family minister to our neighbor who seems like she lives by herself and doesn't want to talk to anybody, or, the elderly couple that we don't know where they're from, or, all these things. So it assumes a life of hospitality, which can look more than just having people over for dinner, but it certainly isn't less than that. But that is such a great way to teach our kids so many things about the Christian life, but especially to help them to build relationships with people who don't believe what we believe.
Yeah. And another way is that when you get that knock on the door and you open up the door and there are 2 Mormon missionaries standing at your door, or there are representatives from, the local Kingdom Hall, Jehovah's Witnesses, or whoever. They've come to your house to ask you if you're willing to talk to them about God. It doesn't get any easier than that. So that's when you say, yes, I'm going to take this opportunity and invite them in, or oftentimes it's scheduling an appointment for them to come back. But invite them in and say, 1 second before we start this conversation, let me get my kids. And we've done that. We've had Mormon missionaries in our home, and we've said, hey, we want our kids to be part of this. In fact, I remember that time that we had the Jehovah's Witness, they came over. It was a veteran, if you will, older guy who was stronger in the faith, and then he brought kind of his apprentice. And when they sat down, we said, well, we want all the kids to come, and the kids were younger at that point. Yeah. So it was a mixed age, but some younger elementary age of some of our kids. Toddler. And they were. I remember the lead guy. He was a bit surprised. Like, oh, you want
your kids to hear this?
So, but the point is that's an opportunity. In fact, even if you haven't seen missionaries at your door for a while, you can I think you can go to LDS.org, which is Latter-day Saints, which is the Mormon kind of official website. Or it might be Mormon.org, where you can then sign up to have missionaries come visit you. So you can put your contact info, they'll contact you, set up a time, and just make sure your kids are there and participating in that conversation. Or if they're younger, just listening in on that conversation.
Yeah, even if they're playing Legos on the ground, but they're hearing the conversation. Okay, but to think about what maybe some people, like what you're saying that we do sounds so terrifying to some people. They're thinking, okay, Brett, you're an apologist. Okay, you're going to have Mormons over, but,
Yeah. So this is not just motivating for the students, but for us as adults. And I mean, I think of the times when I know that I'm going to purposely expose myself to an unbeliever or for instance, I've done a couple of debates. Not my favorite thing to do, but I've done a couple of them with atheists publicly on college campuses. And I'll tell you what, there is nothing to motivate you like scheduling that time. And so you schedule the time for the Mormons to come over, then you are going to be motivated to study and prepare and to do some of your own homework before they come back. The other thing I would say too, though, is that you don't have to know everything.
Yeah.
But you can ask a lot of questions. Your time with the Mormons in your house or the Jehovah's Witnesses or whoever can just be a lot of you asking them questions like, what do you guys believe? What do you think about God? What do you think about Jesus? What do you think about his work on the cross? Or what do you think about the afterlife? And why do you believe those things? Where are the scriptures that you would point to that would teach that? And so you can ask, what do you believe and why do you believe it in lots of different ways? And that can be the first part of your engagement.
Yeah, and I think just lastly to add to that, I think we're afraid as parents to make Christianity look bad in front of our kids or for our kids to see that we don't know how to answer something. But I think that can be an opportunity. Again, we've talked so much about how parenting, a posture in parenting should be humbleness and saying that it's okay if our kids see that we didn't have an answer to something, because there's no way our kids are always going to have an answer.
Yeah.
And so they'll know we're safe people to come to when we don't do it perfectly,
Yeah, and when they see us motivated to then go study and to read and research and to just love God with our mind.
Yeah.
And that we are still growing even as adults, that we haven't arrived, you know. Yeah, that is just that modeling is so vital.
Yeah.
And
it could almost leave more of an imprint than even the conversation, I'm thinking. To see your parents as co-learners with you, as people who aren't perfect, it's encouraging as just a person, because you realize those weaknesses in yourself too. So yeah, I think all that you're saying can sound quite scary, but I think it's saying, no, I'm gonna get in the game here. I'm gonna start doing some things, and it's gonna help me grow, and it's gonna be good for my kids to see me grow. If they're little, my kids are just gonna see that this is a normal part of my life, and then it will become to them what they think is a normal part of Christian life.
Yeah. So, all of this gives us an opportunity to expose our kids to unbelievers. It gives us a chance to model for them, participate with them. So figuring out how to have people in your home. I think another thing you can do in your home in terms of exposing your kids to false beliefs is just kind of being intentional about maybe watching a movie or watching the news. And this is one way to expose them to false ideas, right? I mean, we know them. The movies contain all kinds of ideas that you can watch with your kid, but then afterwards make sure you have some conversations. And that's a little less threatening, right, than inviting the Mormons at your door in. So maybe this is the first step for a family, is to say, hey, we're going to watch this particular movie, and we're going to maybe do some research beforehand. kind of pick a movie that has a non-Christian theme, or promote some kind of non-Christian ideas or challenging ideas. We're going to watch it, and either throughout we're going to pause and we're going to talk through it, or at the end we'll do a debrief. But really helping our young people kind of discern those ideas and then kind of engage them just by watching a movie or watching the news, or seeing a politician give a speech or whatever it might be.
Yeah, I mean, the story about our daughter knowing what pantheism is, it's not because we've pulled out textbooks. It's because we're a big Star Wars family. And so we've talked about that in Star Wars. I mean, we have talked about it other times too, but that Star Wars is a great way to, we love those movies, but of course there's ideas that are coming through with those movies. Our kids saw a movie the other day, and we were talking about it, and I said to them, okay, so does the movie make you root for basically the guy who's doing the bad thing or the guy who's doing the good thing? And they said, oh yeah, it actually made you root for the guy who was doing the bad thing. And I said, yeah, isn't that so manipulative that you end up liking the guy who's... So it's just things like that you can just pull from, and it's just helping kids be aware of the false ideas, all kinds of stuff that comes through in, of course, the media we consume. And it's not just, the relationships, but it's all these things are all around us. So it's actually, once you start looking, it's quite easy to find things that you can talk about with your kids.
Yeah. And here's a third way to try to purposely expose our kids to unbelief. But it's by getting other people involved. And so maybe you're part of a Christian school, or maybe your kids are part of a youth group, or maybe you're part of a homeschool co-op, or maybe you just have some friends who are good friends and they've got kids around your kids' age, or it doesn't even have to be kids the same age as your kids. It could just be families that get together and say, all right, let's try to do this together. And let's call up the local mosque or the local Buddhist temple or whoever and say, hey, can we come take a tour? We want to bring our families and we want to do a little tour of your, religious site, and have you or a representative of your church or mosque or monastery, have them share with us a little bit about what you guys believe. And so get a few people and make it a field trip. Right. In fact, we actually did this when we were doing youth ministry. We would do a series on world religion, and we would take Buddhism and teach about Buddhism, teach our young people what Buddhists believe, and then we would call up the local Buddhist temple and get a tour. And they were more than happy to do this. And it just was amazing how, getting it out of the classroom setting and then into a real situation where now they're talking to a Buddhist monk, and now they're touring the temple, and they're seeing the idols, and it just brought it to life. And they were so much more engaged with it.
Yeah. Yeah, and that, again, the posture of that is that we're learning. We don't go in as a team to beat up on the Buddhist monk with all of our Christian idea. Like when we took our students, it was very much, we're going to learn about their beliefs, and then we debrief with them afterwards. So the whole point and posture of it really is to learn, especially in these situations where we're not going to have ongoing relationships with the people. It is to help our kids and ourselves learn these ideas, so then we can weigh them against the Christian worldview and see, like you said, what false ideas are in there.
Yeah. And I think the other aspect of this that we've kind of been hitting on, but you get to live this out with your kids. And when we take students on these immersive experiences, it's like you said, it's not about beating someone up. It's not about winning an argument.
Yeah.
It's about sharing with them the truth, but then also loving them. It's like, okay, well, now here this Buddhist monk is in front of me, and how should I treat him? Right? How do I view him? This is an opportunity where you get to help your young people let their theology come to life and say, that Buddhist monk or that atheist or whoever it is, they're made in the image of God. And they have value and dignity, and we should treat them as such. And then afterwards, what we would do when we had Mormons in our house with our kids or when we're on one of these immersive experiences is that we spend time praying for that person. And we have seen students just their hearts broken for lost people after being on these experiences. And so you just get to model not only what we know, but what we, how we should live.
Yeah.
And so there's just this really holistic part of it. So all that to say, we just can't recommend highly enough exposing your kids to false beliefs and doing it in the right way, doing it kind of carefully, but we need to get our young people exposed to false ideas so that we can prepare them with the truth and then also prepare them to live their life on mission for Jesus.